I love the power of our stories to really foster change and to impact people's lives, to change perceptions. And I know so many of you have compelling stories you need to tell. And it comes down to what is that story? I have lots of people coming to me and saying, I've got a story that I want to write about struggling with addiction, or I've got a story about a really dysfunctional childhood, or I want to write a story about the death of my grandparents and how much they impacted my lives, or about leaving this unhappy, abusive marriage. And I always say, that's great. Those sound like great topics. But what's the story? What is the story that you want to convey? What's the message that you want to leave readers with? What's the takeaway? What's the theme? When I was working on my first book, memoir, Hippie Boy, I knew that the story was about my dysfunctional childhood. But when I really drilled down on what was that takeaway message for readers, I realized that my story that I wanted to tell was a story about finding my voice and power. I realized that the takeaway for readers was that we all had the power within us to save ourselves, that we didn't need others to save us. I realized that it was a story about resilience. So again, think about it. What is the theme? What is the takeaway for readers? Okay, once you've got the general idea of what your story message is, what it is that you want to convey, then you've got to think about the story arc. Remember that when you're telling a personal story, it's not your life story. Rather, it's a story from your life, and it can be happy, it can be devastating, it can be scary or exhilarating. But like any good fiction novel, there's got to be a story arc. Something's got to happen to take readers from point A to point B to make them care. Think about it. What is the arc of your story? What happens? What's that climax? Okay. So, the other thing to think about once you've kind of started thinking through those things, the message, the story arc, it's like, where does that story start and where does it end? For me, like I realized ultimately after throwing away quite a few chapters that my story took place from the age of when I was almost 9 till when I was 16. So I thought it started when my mom decided to move our family from northern Utah to Mississippi in a last-ditch effort to save her marriage to my dad. And really quickly it blew up and they got divorced. Okay, so that's where I thought my story started. And I started my career as a journalist, so I always just thought that you write stories chronologically. That's all I knew how to do. So I started writing that book. So I wrote the first few chapters. And then I took an advanced memoir writing course where we would submit a couple of our first chapters, the first 2 chapters of our book. So I submitted that first chapter, and the instructor said, great, I really like it. And then I submitted the second chapter, and he said, wait, where are you going with this story? And I said, well, just wait until you get to chapter 8, because then it really gets going, because that's when my stepdad, Earl, enters the scene. And he's this horrible little man who uses his religious authority as a weapon to really abuse and oppress my family. And that's what gets me out on the road with my dad and really gets this story going. And he said, well, if that's what really kicks off the story, if that's the key conflict, then that's got to be the opening chapter. And I said, no, you're wrong. Not only are you wrong, you're dead wrong. It's not like life was a piece of cake before this stepdad entered the scene. There is a lot of background that the readers need to know. For one thing, my dad, the very charismatic, had a very explosive temper, also a very big dreamer, always wanted to make that $1 million. And he left our family for months at a time, living on the road as a freewheeling vagabond salesman, rarely sent any money home. And when he was home, my parents were fighting all the time. It was really kind of a scary environment. My mom, on the other hand, grew up in Austria. Only child, was abused, beginning of World War II. And she very much wanted to escape that life. So she immigrated to the United States and she converted to Mormonism, turned her life over to religion, was very devoutly religious, and kind of like a beaten down woman. And there was so much poverty. So that was the background that I wanted to convey. And I told that to this instructor, and he said no. And he was pretty patient, but he said, look, again, if the key conflict that gets your story going is that stepdad. That's where you need to start it. And then you can give all the background that you want, but you've got to start it with the action. So I finally listened to him and I took that chapter 8 and I turned it into the first chapter, restructured it to really serve as the foundation for the book and setting up the struggle that he won't let me go with my dad, saying that God doesn't want me to be with my dad. And then I went back and gave all the background from 4 years before when my mom moves our family to Mississippi to try to save her marriage and how that explodes and then leads up to when this stepdad enters the scene. And then the story continues on from there and it worked out great. And I didn't even realize that I just written or used the most common story structure format out there until a couple of years later. I was reading Anne Lamont's Bird by Bird, and she talked about the ABDCE story format. It stands for action, background, development, climax, ending. And it was like something just clicked. It was like, that was exactly what I used for Hippie Boy without even realizing it. It opens with the action when that stepdad enters the scene when I'm almost 13 and using his religious authority to say that I can't go with my dad, that God won't allow it. Then I go and give all the background, those 4 years preceding to that. And then the story continues to develop. Once this stepdad enters the scene and says, I can't go with my dad, I become very defiant and start spending my summers, the day school gets out at the age of 13 up to 16, on the road with my dad, living out of the back of his truck, hustling tools, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. And he really becomes my lifeline and my escape. I really look at him as my savior, the thing that gets me through those long, horrible school years at home. So that's how it develops until I'm 16 and I'm on the road with him and he gets arrested. He gets arrested for embezzlement, wanted on embezzlement charges in Texas. And they say they're going to extradite him to Texas and put me into foster care. That is the climax. That's my aha moment, because that's the moment that I realize that my dad's not going to save me. Nobody is going to save me but me. And that day I find my voice. I finally almost yell out a request for help with the judge, and he has empathy and lets my dad out on a fugitive bond. And I take that newfound voice and power with me back to Utah. And for the first time ever, I find the courage to stand up to him and to fight back and ultimately get him out of our house, which is the ending. All right. Again, ABDCE: action, background, development, climax, ending. And like I said, it was like this light bulb had gone off, because then I started looking at the structure when I would watch films or when I would read books and realize that they all use some form of this action, background, development, climax, ending. But then I started working with a lot of students who were trying to tell these kind of big, messy stories that didn't fall into kind of that standard. Here's the action, and then here's the background leading back up to it, and the development, climax, ending. I would have students say, well, yeah, I want to write about kind of struggles with abuse and my parents divorcing and homelessness that has led me to cutting myself, or I want to write this big story about the death of my grandparents and all the reasons why they meant so much to me. In my life, there were so many reasons. How do I tell these bigger, messy stories? And I call this the container format, looking for a container or a frame to tell this bigger story that doesn't necessarily have one cohesive backstory. Okay, and again, it still uses that base ABDCE model. It's just where these backstories come in and the fact that they aren't kind of connected. They can be these disjointed backstories that are relevant to the kind of story that you're trying to tell right now. I'll give you an example. If you've read the book, or have any of you read that book, Wild by Cheryl Strayed, and her story takes place on the Pacific Crest Trail, 3 or 4 months hiking along that trail in a search to really heal and find herself. This is very much the container model. She uses that 3 or 4 month hike, I can't remember which, on that trail to find herself. But why is she there? What are the reasons why? And those backstories that have gotten her to this place are varied in quite a few. One is that her mother, who she loved dearly, has just died of cancer. One reason why, one backstory. Another reason is that she'd gotten married young, and while she married a good guy, you know, the marriage was kind of struggling and she had been cheating and trying to figure out what she wants to do now. Another reason why. Also, she had started dabbling with drugs and she had kind of gotten off the path that she was on with her life, her quest for her dreams, her passions. You know, she had lost her way. Another reason why. Again, though, by using that hike as the container to hold together that story, she's able to go in and tell a much bigger, larger story. I'll give you another example of this. I was working once with a guy and he was trying to tell kind of this big, messy story about his struggle with self medication, his struggle with anxiety and with depression and chronic pain. And he knew that it ultimately stemmed down to his childhood. He had a bipolar mom that he grew up with, and um, you know, she was very verbally abusive, sometimes starting to kill herself and blaming it on him, you know, and as a result, he had built this protective wall around him. And so while his life on the outside looked perfect, I mean, a beautiful family, financially successful, great career, but on the inside, he was imploding. Everything was imploding because of all this pain and the depression and the anxiety that had led to this self-medicating through alcohol. Okay, how does he tell this story? Well, ultimately, he decided to use, again, the container model, taking a month at an inpatient treatment center to tell that story, using that as the container. So again, his story starts with the action because that ABDCE ultimately is the core of everything, right? Starts with the action. It's the day after Christmas, and he's leaving his family on the way to the airport in a cab, not knowing if he's going to have a family come back to at the end of it. Again, on the outside, it looks great, but everything's a mess because of this anxiety and depression and self-medication. Then he gets to that inpatient treatment center, and it's through that month there, through some of his therapy sessions and these experiences, that he then can drill down on the reasons why he is where he is at in his life. So unhappy, so miserable, self-medicating. All right. Again, lots of reasons why. You know, the bipolar mom that had been abusive, you know, then other points in his life that had ultimately led to anxiety into that, building that wall of protection and that chronic pain and the depression that had led to him to self-medicating. Lots of reasons why. And in his case, you know, there's all these kind of aha moments that are building up to that climax. A lot of kind of smaller moments, right? Because sometimes it's not always just one big climax moment. There can be little ahas that build up to it that ultimately makes him realize that he had been shoving all of this pain, all of this down. And by taking it out, getting it out and looking at it and acknowledging at it, it is that moment when he realizes that then he can heal. Once he's got it out and can look at it in its face and acknowledge it, he can start healing. And that leads to his ending when he realizes, okay, now he can get the help he needs and he's going to be okay. And he's going to be able to stop self-medicating with alcohol. All right. I'll give you one more example of this. If any of you have seen the film Black Mass, it's about the mobster Whitey Bulger. Now, the container that's used for this film, or the frame that holds this film together, is an interrogation between an FBI agent and one of this mobster's associates. So the frame, you know, the container takes place in that interrogation room. And it's those questions that are being lobbed at that associate that enables us to go and tell the story, take the pieces of his relationship with that mobster and bring them in through these answers and use that to tell this bigger story of his relationship with that mobster. Okay, the third model that I'm going to talk about, and keep in mind, these are by no means the end all to story structures, but these are three very common ways to structure a story, to tell a story, and to really grab readers and pull them in, is the perspective model. Now, in this case, envision a box, an open box, okay, with flaps on either side. So in this case, you're starting the story more in the present moment. Like if you want to Look back at that life-changing event in your life, this event that was so powerful that maybe changed the trajectory of your life. And you want to tell that big story, but you want to be able to reflect on it and give perspective. You've got to start at more of a place later, in a present moment. For example, with my book Hippie Boy, that story took place between the age of 9 and 16. So there was no way for me to give perspective because I stayed there in that age frame between 9 and 16. Okay. But let's say you want to look back on this life-changing event and give perspective. That's when you'd use this perspective model. Give you another example. I'm working with a woman right now who's always gracious enough to let me use her example, but she was trying to write a very compelling story about her childhood growing up in South Africa during apartheid. And she grew up, white, upper middle class, privileged. Her parents were American and they were there. Her dad was working there. She grew up, with servants and like really living this life of luxury while the Africans were really suffering and enduring so much hardship and discrimination during apartheid. So it's like, well, how does she tell that story, but also kind of give perspective on when she thinks back on it? So what she did, she opens the story after apartheid, going back down to South Africa with her mother's ashes and her children. She's decided she's going to go back to South Africa to bury her mother's ashes with her dad, who's buried in Johannesburg. So she gets off the plane there in Johannesburg and she is rattled. She does not recognize the South Africa from her childhood, even though she's really happy about the advancements that have been made, about, the abolishment of the different whites only and black only lines, all of the horrible practices that took place. She's just so rattled because she doesn't recognize her childhood. And she uses that memoir in that present to now go back and tell her children and tell readers about her childhood growing up in South Africa during apartheid and what that life was like. Then, though, at the end, she comes back to that present day when she is there with her mother's ashes and her children to now reflect back on that childhood and her feelings about it, the guilt that she feels. Again, growing up there as an upper middle class privileged white person and remembering, that her family, while they didn't believe in discrimination, were complicit. They did not speak out. Her parents were always saying, we are guests in their country, so we abide by their rules. But now, in the aftermath, post-apartheid, she's feeling a lot of guilt and wishing they had approached things differently. Again, the perspective model, because it enables her to look back and give that reflection. One more example of this, if you've seen the film Saving Private Ryan, that film opens in a cemetery, and there's an elderly man standing by a gravesite full of anguish. That's the opening shot. And now the film goes back and tells the story behind this. All right, it goes back into World War II, and this sergeant, I believe, leading a small group of men in to save this soldier from sure death because his mom has already lost all of her other sons. I think she had 6 other sons, and the American government wanted her to at least have one son who survived. But what we learn is that this man, in saving that soldier's life, ends up dying, getting killed. Now we come back to the present. In that cemetery, again, this elderly man standing by that gravestone, and now we understand that he's there paying tribute to that sergeant who gave his life to save his so that he could live his life. Again, that's the perspective structure. Let me throw in one more quick one that sometimes people use, and it's called the braided structure. In this case, let's say you want to tell a story from 2 different perspectives. There's a book that comes to mind. It's called Den of Lions by Terry Anderson. He was the longest held hostage in the Lebanon hostage crisis in the late 80s, early 90s. And he wrote this book, Den of Lions, But he wanted to also give his fiance a voice because right after he was taken, she gave birth to their childhood. So while she's living with their child, wondering what's happening to him, he is, a hostage for 7 years. So in this case, they do the braided approach where every other chapter they alternate voices. So he's telling his story during the 7 years of captivity, and she's telling her story on the outside during his 7 years of captivity. So that's an example of a braided structure, okay? All right, so a quick recap. Remember that when it comes to telling your story, it's not your life story, it's a story from your life. Think about the takeaway for readers. Think about the message you want to convey. Think about the story arc. And then once you've figured that out, think about which of these structures works best for you. Is that standard ABDCE format, like I use for Hippie Boy, the right structure? Or do you have a bigger, messier story that has lots of different backstories that are relevant to the story that you're telling, where you could use that container model? Or does that perspective model work best for you, where you're looking back on that life-changing event, that event that changed the trajectory of your life, and you want to give perspective, you want to reflect on that? Or do you have a story that lends itself to that braided structure I just mentioned, where maybe you want to tell two parallel stories going on that work cohesively together, and then you can bring it together at the end? Okay, now it's your turn. I want you to go home and I want you to start working on your story. Remember, thinking about the message you want to convey, your story arc, and the structure that will really grab readers and pull them into your story. Okay, you've got this. Thank you.